Welcome to Askprep, your trusted destination for focused and effective learning. Today, we will study the Silk Roads, the first age of globalization. Globalization is often described as a modern phenomenon, driven by technology, rapid transportation, and digital communication. However, the foundations of globalization were laid thousands of years ago. Long before modern nations and borders existed, distant regions of the world were already connected through trade, travel, and cultural exchange. These early connections shaped human history in ways that still influence us today. At the heart of this ancient global network were the Silk Roads. These routes linked East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe into a vast system of interaction. Along these paths, merchants, travelers, monks, and diplomats carried not only goods but also ideas, beliefs, and knowledge. The Silk Roads marked the beginning of a truly interconnected world. What were the Silk Roads? The Silk Roads were not a single road or a clearly defined highway. They were a vast and flexible network of routes that changed over time according to political power, geography, and climate. Some paths disappeared, while new ones emerged. Together, they formed a living system of movement that connected distant civilizations across Eurasia and beyond. These routes began in East Asia, particularly in ancient China, where goods were produced in large quantities and high quality. From the capital city of Chang'an, traders moved westward, carrying silk, jade, ceramics, and lacquerware. From there, the routes branched in multiple directions, adapting to mountains, deserts, and rivers. Central Asia played a crucial role in the Silk Roads. This region acted as a bridge between East and West. Nomadic societies, oasis towns, and merchant communities controlled key passages. Without Central Asia, the Silk Roads could not have functioned, as it provided both geographical access and cultural mediation. The deserts of Central Asia, especially the Taklamakan Desert, posed extreme challenges. Travelers avoided crossing directly through the desert and instead followed its edges, stopping at oases where water and shelter were available. These oases later grew into major trading cities that sustained long-distance commerce. Trade along the Silk Roads worked through a chain system. Most merchants traveled only short or medium distances. Goods changed hands many times before reaching their final destination. A bolt of silk produced in China might pass through dozens of traders before arriving in a Roman marketplace. The Silk Roads were not limited to luxury goods alone. While silk, spices, and precious stones were highly valued, everyday items such as textiles, tools, agricultural products, and animals were also exchanged. This trade influenced local economies and daily life across regions. Beyond material goods, the Silk Roads enabled the movement of people. Soldiers, diplomats, pilgrims, scholars, and migrants all used these routes. Each traveler carried stories, customs, languages, and knowledge, making the Silk Roads a powerful engine of cultural exchange. In essence, the Silk Roads were the world's first large-scale communication network. They connected societies that were separated by thousands of kilometers, allowing them to interact, influence one another, and slowly become part of a shared global history. Silk, the fabric that changed history. Silk was the most famous and influential product traded along the Silk Roads, but its importance went far beyond fashion or luxury. In the ancient world, silk represented refinement, advanced knowledge, and political power. Its smooth texture and natural shine made it unlike any other fabric known at the time, instantly capturing the imagination of distant civilizations. The origins of silk production lay deep within ancient China. According to legend, the discovery of silk was made by Empress Leju, who observed silkworms spinning cocoons. Over centuries, Chinese artisans perfected the complex process of sericulture, including mulberry cultivation, silkworm breeding, and delicate weaving techniques. For thousands of years, China guarded the secret of silk with extreme care. The knowledge of how silk was made became a state secret. Smuggling silkworm eggs or revealing production methods was considered treason and punishable by death. This monopoly gave China immense economic and diplomatic power. Silk quickly became a form of currency in its own right. It was used to pay soldiers, reward officials, and conduct diplomatic exchanges. Entire economies were shaped by the demand for silk, and trade routes expanded primarily to meet this demand from the West. In the Roman Empire, silk was both admired and feared. Roman elites were fascinated by its beauty, yet conservative thinkers criticized it as a corrupting luxury that weakened moral discipline. Despite criticism, silk garments became status symbols worn by emperors and aristocrats. Silk also played a role in cultural transformation. As silk traveled across regions, local weavers experimented with new patterns, dyes, and designs. This led to hybrid textile traditions that blended Chinese techniques with Persian, Indian, and Mediterranean aesthetics. Eventually, the secret of silk production spread beyond China. Through migration, espionage, and diplomacy, knowledge reached Central Asia, India, and later Byzantium. Once silk production expanded, new centers of manufacturing emerged, reducing China's monopoly but increasing global connectivity. In this way, silk became more than a commodity. It was a driving force of globalization, shaping trade networks, political relationships, cultural exchange, and the very structure of the ancient world. Caravan cities, oases of civilization. Travel along the Silk Roads was never easy. Merchants and travelers faced long distances, extreme temperatures, dangerous terrain, and constant threats from bandits. Journeys could take months or even years, and survival depended on careful planning and cooperation. In this harsh environment, caravan cities became essential lifelines. Caravan cities developed at strategic locations, usually near rivers, mountain passes, or desert oases where water and food were available. These locations allowed caravans to rest, repair equipment, and replenish supplies. Without such cities, long-distance trade across Eurasia would have been impossible. Cities such as Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, Merv, and Danhuang grew wealthy and powerful through their role in Silk Road trade. Their markets were filled with goods from distant lands, Chinese silk, Indian spices, Persian carpets, Arabian incense, and Roman glassware. These cities became symbols of prosperity and opportunity. Caravan cities were not only commercial centers but also cultural crossroads. People from different ethnicities, religions, and languages lived side by side. Streets echoed with multiple tongues, and religious buildings of different faiths stood close to one another, reflecting a rare level of tolerance and coexistence. Knowledge flourished in these urban hubs. Scholars exchanged ideas on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. Libraries, schools, and workshops emerged, turning caravan cities into centers of learning as well as trade. Political power often followed economic importance. Rulers who controlled caravan cities gained wealth through taxes and protection fees. Many invested heavily in infrastructure such as roads, inns, warehouse, and city walls to attract merchants and ensure safe passage. Caravanserais, large roadside inns found near these cities, played a crucial role in sustaining trade. They provided secure lodging for merchants, animals, and goods. These spaces encouraged interaction, negotiation, and trust among traders from different regions. Over time, caravan cities became engines of globalization. They connected distant civilizations, blended cultures, and shaped regional identities. Even after the decline of the Silk Roads, their legacy continued to influence art, architecture, and urban life across Asia and the Middle East. Religions and ideas on the move. One of the most powerful and lasting impacts of the Silk Roads was the movement of religions and ideas across vast distances. Trade routes did more than connect markets, they connected minds. As merchants and travelers moved from one region to another, they carried with them beliefs, philosophies, and worldviews that transformed societies. Buddhism was one of the earliest religions to spread along the Silk Roads. Originating in the Indian subcontinent, Buddhist monks traveled north and east, establishing monasteries in Central Asia and China. These monasteries served as spiritual centers, places of learning, and safe shelters for travelers, allowing Buddhism to take deep root in East Asia. As Buddhism moved across regions, it adapted to local cultures. Art, architecture, and religious practices changed, creating unique forms of Buddhism in China, Korea, and Japan. This cultural blending showed how ideas evolved as they traveled, rather than remaining fixed or unchanged. Islam expanded rapidly through Silk Road networks after the 7th century. Muslim merchants, scholars, and travelers carried Islamic beliefs across Arabia, Persia, Central Asia, and South Asia. Trade and faith reinforced each other, as shared religious values helped build trust between distant trading communities. Christianity also spread eastward along these routes. Nestorian Christian communities appeared in Central Asia and China, demonstrating how far religious ideas could travel. Though often minorities, these communities became part of the diverse spiritual landscape of Silk Road cities. Along with organized religions, philosophical and scientific ideas moved freely. Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Persian astronomy, and Chinese medical knowledge interacted and influenced one another. This exchange laid the foundations for advances in science, medicine, and education. Translation played a crucial role in this process. Scholars translated texts from one language to another, preserving and sharing knowledge across cultures. Libraries and learning centers in Silk Road cities became meeting points for intellectual exchange. Through the movement of religions and ideas, the Silk Roads reshaped how people understood the world and their place within it. These routes did not simply move goods, they transformed belief systems, intellectual traditions, and cultural identities across continents. Great travelers and witnesses. Journeys connected distant worlds. These men and women crossed mountains, deserts, and seas, acting as witnesses to an interconnected world long before the modern age. Their accounts provide rare insight into how different civilizations perceived one another. Among the most famous of these travelers was Marco Polo. Born in Venice, he journeyed eastward with his family and eventually reached the court of the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan. Marco Polo spent many years in China, observing its cities, administration, technology, and culture with fascination. When Marco Polo returned to Europe, his stories astonished his audience. He described paper money, vast cities, efficient postal systems, and immense wealth, features largely unknown in Europe at the time. Though some doubted his tales, his writings expanded Europe's imagination and curiosity about Asia. Equally important was Ibn Battuta, a scholar and traveler from Morocco. Over nearly 30 years, he traveled across North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. His journeys covered more ground than those of Marco Polo, revealing the scale of the medieval connected world. Ibn Battuta's accounts show how shared religious and legal systems helped unify distant regions. Wherever he traveled within the Islamic world, he found familiar institutions, languages, and customs. This cultural continuity made long-distance travel possible and relatively safe. Beyond these famous figures, countless lesser-known travelers used the Silk Roads. Merchants, monks, diplomats, and pilgrims crossed borders every day. Buddhist monks journeyed in search of sacred texts, while scholars traveled to study with renowned teachers in distant cities. These travelers acted as carriers of information. They brought news of distant lands, political changes, natural disasters, and new technologies. In a world without newspapers or instant communication, such first-hand accounts were invaluable. Through their journeys and writings, these travelers preserved the memory of the Silk Roads. They helped later generations understand that the medieval world was not isolated, but deeply interconnected through networks of movement, exchange, and shared human experience. The dark side, disease and death. The Silk Roads connected the ancient world in unprecedented ways, but this connectivity carried a hidden and deadly cost. As people, animals, and goods moved across continents, so did diseases. For the first time in history, epidemics were able to spread across vast distances, turning trade routes into pathways of biological exchange. Merchants traveled in large caravans, often living in crowded conditions alongside pack animals, such as horses and camels. Goods were stored in warehouse and caravanserais where rodents and insects thrived. fleas carried by rats became silent travelers, moving unnoticed from one settlement to another, carrying deadly pathogens across regions. The most catastrophic result of this movement was the Black Death. Believed to have originated in Central or East Asia, the plague followed Silk Road routes westward during the 14th century. As caravans reached cities in the Middle East and Europe, the disease spread rapidly, overwhelming societies that had no understanding of infection or immunity. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. Entire cities were abandoned, villages vanished from maps, and populations collapsed. In some regions, nearly half the population died within a few years. Economic activity slowed, agriculture failed, and social structures that had existed for centuries were suddenly destabilized. Fear and uncertainty dominated daily life. Without scientific explanations, people turned to religion, superstition, and blame. Minority communities were often targeted, while others believed the plague was divine punishment. These reactions revealed the psychological and cultural impact of pandemics on connected societies. The long-term consequences of the Black Death reshaped history. Labor shortages weakened feudal systems, increased the bargaining power of workers, and shifted economic relationships. In Europe, these changes contributed to the gradual transformation of medieval society and the emergence of new social orders. The plague also left a deep mark on art, literature, and philosophy. Themes of mortality, decay, and the fragility of life dominated cultural expression. Societies were forced to confront the limits of human control in an interconnected world. The dark history of disease along the Silk Roads offers a powerful lesson. Global connections bring progress, but they also spread risk. The ancient world learned, at great cost, that globalization has consequences, a lesson that remains relevant in the modern age. Empires and the Silk Roads. The Silk Roads did not exist independently of political power. Their growth, stability, and decline were closely tied to the rise and fall of empires. Strong states provided security, infrastructure, and legal systems that made long-distance trade possible. When empires weakened, routes fragmented and trade suffered. One of the earliest empires to shape the Silk Roads was the Han dynasty of China. By expanding westward into Central Asia, the Han secured key corridors and protected caravans from raids. State-sponsored diplomacy and military presence allowed Chinese goods to move safely beyond their borders, integrating China into a wider Eurasian economy. In the West, the Roman Empire played an equally important role. Roman demand for luxury goods, especially silk, drove trade across thousands of kilometers. Although Rome and China never met directly, the desire of Roman elites for Eastern products sustained the entire network. Roman roads, ports, and markets formed the western anchor of the Silk Roads. Between these great powers lay a series of empires and kingdoms, including the Parthians and the Sassanids, who controlled crucial middle sections of the routes. These states acted as intermediaries, profiting from tolls, taxes, and trade services. Their political decisions often determined which routes flourished and which declined. The greatest transformation came with the rise of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century. For the first time, a single political authority controlled much of the Silk Roads from East Asia to Eastern Europe. The Mongols enforced laws, protected travelers, and punished banditry, creating an unprecedented level of security. This period of stability is known as Pax Mongolica. Under Mongol rule, merchants, diplomats, missionaries, and scholars could travel vast distances with relative safety. Trade expanded dramatically, and cultural exchange intensified. Technologies, ideas, and even artistic styles moved more freely than ever before. However, empires were not permanent. As Mongol unity collapsed and regional powers emerged, security along the Silk Roads declined. Political fragmentation, warfare, and instability made long-distance trade more dangerous and less profitable. The history of the Silk Roads shows that globalization depends on governance. Empires could either connect the world through stability and cooperation or divide it through conflict and collapse. Power and trade were inseparable forces shaping the ancient global system. The Maritime Silk Roads. while the land-based Silk Roads are the most famous, an equally important network developed across the seas. These maritime routes connected East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa through the Indian Ocean and surrounding waters. Together, they formed what historians call the Maritime Silk Roads, extending the reach of global trade beyond deserts and mountains. Maritime trade offered several advantages over overland routes. Ships could carry far larger quantities of goods at a lower cost, and sea travel reduced dependence on fragile land corridors controlled by rival powers. As shipbuilding and navigation improved, merchants increasingly turned to the oceans to move silk, spices, ceramics, metals, and textiles across vast distances. Knowledge of monsoon winds made long-distance sea travel possible. Sailors learned to time their voyages according to seasonal wind patterns, allowing relatively predictable journeys between ports in China, India, Arabia, and Africa. This understanding of nature became a critical form of technological knowledge passed between generations of seafarers. Port cities emerged as the beating hearts of maritime trade. Cities such as Guangzhou, Calicut, Malacca, Aden, and Kilwa grew into cosmopolitan hubs where merchants from many cultures lived and worked together. These ports were places of negotiation, translation, intermarriage, and cultural blending, reflecting the global character of oceanic trade. The Maritime Silk Roads also accelerated cultural and religious exchange. Buddhism, Islam, and later other belief systems spread along sea routes, often faster than on land. Ideas, artistic styles, and technologies moved from port to port, reshaping coastal societies across the Indian Ocean world. African, Arab, Indian, and Southeast Asian traders all played active roles in maritime networks. Trade was not dominated by a single civilization but depended on cooperation among many regions. Gold, ivory, spices, cotton, porcelain, and knowledge flowed in multiple directions, creating mutual dependence. Over time, maritime trade began to rival and eventually surpass land-based Silk Roads. As ships became larger and navigation more reliable, oceans replaced deserts as the main highways of global exchange. This shift marked a major transition in world history. The Maritime Silk Roads laid the foundation for the modern global economy. They demonstrated that the seas could unite continents just as effectively as land routes, completing the first truly global system of trade and interaction. Decline of the Silk Roads. By the late medieval period, the vast networks that had sustained the Silk Roads for centuries began to weaken. The decline was not sudden, nor caused by a single event. Instead, it resulted from a combination of political, economic, technological, and environmental changes that gradually reshaped global trade patterns. One major factor was political instability across Central Asia and the Middle East. As large empires fractured into smaller rival states, security along overland routes deteriorated. Banditry increased, wars disrupted trade corridors, and merchants faced higher risks and costs. Without strong centralized authority, the long-distance protection that had once enabled safe passage disappeared. The collapse of Mongol unity played a critical role. During the era of Pax Mongolica, traders could cross continents under a single imperial system. When the Mongol Empire fragmented, borders hardened, taxes multiplied, and diplomatic cooperation declined. The Silk Roads lost the political foundation that had allowed them to flourish. At the same time, maritime trade continued to grow in importance. Advances in shipbuilding, navigation, and cartography made sea routes faster, cheaper, and more reliable than overland travel. European powers, seeking direct access to Asian goods, increasingly invested in oceanic exploration rather than traditional land routes. The arrival of European maritime empires marked a turning point. Portuguese, Spanish, and later Dutch and British traders established sea-based trade networks that bypassed Central Asia entirely. This shift reduced the economic importance of caravan cities and inland routes that had once thrived on Silk Road commerce. Environmental factors also contributed to the decline. Climate changes affected pasturelands and water supplies, disrupting nomadic societies that had supported caravan trade. Epidemics, including repeated outbreaks of plague, further discouraged long-distance land travel and weakened population centers along the routes. Despite this decline, the Silk Roads never fully disappeared. Local and regional trade continued, and many routes remained active for centuries. Cultural connections, religious networks, and shared knowledge endured long after large-scale trade diminished. The decline of the Silk Roads marked not an end, but a transition. The world did not become less connected, it became connected in new ways. The focus of globalization shifted from land to sea, setting the stage for the modern, ocean-based global system that would follow. The story of the Silk Roads is ultimately the story of human connection. Long before modern technology, nations, or global corporations, people found ways to link distant lands through trade, travel, and shared curiosity. Across deserts, mountains, and oceans, the Silk Roads created pathways that allowed civilizations to interact, learn from one another, and grow together. They prove that globalization is not a modern invention, but a deep and enduring part of human history. Through the Silk Roads, goods moved across continents, but more importantly, ideas, beliefs, technologies, and cultures traveled with them. Religions spread, knowledge expanded, and innovations transformed societies far from their points of origin. At the same time, the Silk Roads revealed the risks of connectivity, disease, conflict, and inequality, showing that global exchange has always carried both promise and danger. The legacy of the Silk Roads still shapes our world today. Modern trade routes, cultural diversity, and global interdependence all echo patterns first established thousands of years ago. By understanding the Silk Roads, we better understand ourselves, a species driven by movement, exchange, and connection. The first age of globalization may belong to the past, but its influence continues to define the present and the future. Thank you for being a valued part of Askprep. Your continuous support and trust motivate us to create meaningful, reliable, and high-quality educational content every day. We are committed to guiding you through your learning journey and helping you achieve your academic and career goals.